disciplined. I appreciate the faith. So I'm Jeff. This is a paper with Nathan here in the front row. I'm not sure if Reka is here, and then Penny and Julia. Julia's a graduate student on the market. I had the level to which she caught up and has been contributing to this project is frankly humbling. And so the usual kind of shout out, or maybe extraordinary shout out, to look at her. She's truly exceptional. Okay, so previous talks were about the US and Malaysia. I'm gonna present cross-country panel data. I'm gonna kind of lean in on data facts to kind of motivate things like what's happening in the semiconductor industry and why do we have things like chips. We've already talked about driver for economic growth, national security as being kind of arguments as to why we have these kinds of policies. A motivation or two motivations for this project are gonna be, we talk a lot about the importance of the industry. No one seems to kind of just present the data. So we're gonna go present a lot of data. And then related to that, this kind of notion of like, oh, we should be supporting this industry, and there's gonna be some sense of like, okay, why? Also data. And then lastly, we're gonna provide some evidence of learning by doing, and we're gonna write down an economic model to understand like the implications of this. So why are we doing this? We think this is important. What questions are we interested in? Are these policies justifiable in an economic context? Like, what are the implications of them? What are the cross-country implications of them? Should the WTO care? What am I gonna talk about today? I'm gonna give you some data facts, just what's happening in the industry, just kind of raw, untortured data. Evidence of cross-country incentives. So this is just gonna be what's happening in the data. Here's what's happening. So what's happening in the industry. Here's what's happening in the countries to actually support them. And then lastly, it's a little bit of kind of I'll spend a grand total of one slide talking about economic modeling to identify learning by doing. Okay, data facts. China's increasing the number of fabs. This is from the company called Semi. We have the universe of all fabs going back to the 90s. I'm gonna focus on early 2000s because that's where kind of all of our data sources overlap. Pretty stable number of fabs. So these are fabrication plants that are producing things. We also have R&D plants. This is not that. This is just stuff that's producing stuff. Fabrication plants that are producing stuff. Okay, more plants. Maybe they're small, no. Big impact on capacity. So is this how many wafers can I produce? How many chips can I produce in 200 millimeter wafer equivalents? So this is just how many chips are coming out of these places. A lot of capacity being built in China. Everything else, we've got increasing capacity, but nothing like China. Doing this is expensive. So we're lumping together all of the build a plant, put the equipment in, and also plant exists, we're adding equipment to it across time, and then looking at the different countries. A lot of money being spent, by China. This is all this, okay, so fine. China's growing, they're producing more stuff, it's really expensive. This is just raw spending. So like the point two is gonna be like, well, kind of can we get a feeling for how much of this is actually government subsidized? By the way, industry hates subsidized, incentives. The government incentives. So kind of some sense of like, well, should we care? Like, those are kind of aggregate stuff. So I'm gonna go put on my like antitrust hat as an IO economist, and I'm gonna say, oh, let's just suppose that like we had something like the DOJ, and we're gonna look at this as an HHI kind of antitrust merger guidelines. So if you think about it by company, TSMC, concentration it's a very unconcentrated industry. Now I can cut this by much finer in terms of technology, but if you just look at that, very unconcentrated. If I look at regional, we see that, so this is by country, so this is where is the fab actually located. We see it's a very concentrated industry. So like rule of thumb here is like 1800 and above, government says that's a concentrated industry. We hit 1800 in like the early 2020s, maybe late 20-teens. Very concentrated industry geographically. This is one of the motivations behind chips and whatnot. It's like, look, there's a lot of this production happening in Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, China. Okay, so we've got this notion of a plant. What is a plant? What is a company? What do they do? Are they just producing one thing? No, they're producing a lot of things. Each plant is producing one thing, but each company owns many plants and they produce a lot of different stuff. So this is from TSMC's, just like a series of quarterly SEC filings where they actually talk about what % of their revenue comes from different technologies. So lower number equals faster. And we see that like at the beginning of time, they're just producing these really big chips. As they go and create new chips, they're not getting rid of the 5, that's like the Ring doorbell. They're still producing the kind of Ring doorbell. But when we get down to here, they're producing a lot of stuff, including the cutting edge stuff where the 5 nanometers isn't even meaningful because like you're so close together at 5 nanometers that the electron starts to jump the gateway. Okay, so TSMC and these companies are producing a lot of stuff. They're multi-product firms. What does China look like compared to Taiwan? Well, this looks like a classic leader-follower game. So I've organized these things in terms of most cutting edge. So think like stuff like NVIDIA with their Blackwell chips to Ring doorbells. And then the bars are the same way. I see purple here. I don't see purple here. China's producing a lot of fabrication facilities, has a lot of capacity, but these are all kind of in the extreme kind of Ring doorbells. They don't want to do that. They want to produce this. They're not. So the kind of open question is why not? Like what is this like industry? Is this something about government incentives? So then 2 more points. So this is from a different data source. We have wafer pricing data from this company called the Global Semiconductor Alliance. So these are, an observation is price, quantity, and then characteristics of the order, like technology, wafer size, and whatnot. And if I just go and I just take quantity, forget about the technology, I'm just gonna say like market share. China at the beginning, they're like 10%, middle digits. They're not producing a whole lot. By the end, they're producing a lot. So they're catching up. Now again, this is not conditioning on technology, but they're starting to produce more stuff. They've built capacity, they're producing more stuff, they're becoming a player. Here's the US. Malaysia's in the data too. Sorry, I put them in other. They're relatively small, but Singapore is very big. And then the big player on all of this is Taiwan. Taiwan and Taiwan Semiconductors were kind of where all this stuff started. Okay, last data fact. If I look at pricing data, so this is median prices by technology. This is kind of, imagine, it's not literally the Ring doorbell, but imagine a Ring doorbell, something that's been around for a long time. Taiwan's more expensive. We get price convergence in the long run. There's standard errors around. There's a lot of, there's a lot of stuff going on, but it's like, these are the medians. So you see convergence in prices. When you invent a new technology, who invents it? Taiwan or TSMC. They're all alone. Eventually China catches up. Where do they catch up? They're much lower priced. We still see a gap into the long run. We see convergence of prices. China's pretty flat. Taiwan's continues to change. Importantly, we don't see like a big, there's not like a big kind of regime shift as soon as Taiwan or China. These are still kind of differentiated goods. Okay, all that stuff was about industry. What are governments doing? So this is related to Nathan and Reika's work, where they're going to go through and look at all of the industrial policies around the world in the text. They developed an algorithm to pull all this stuff and identify what's the stuff from just semiconductors. So preview results, everyone's doing it. Everyone, all the major players, with the exception of Taiwan, interestingly, are doing stuff and being very active in providing incentives to policy. How are they doing it? Okay, so if we just do counts, just chips is one observation. So that's one thing in the bar. We see everyone's doing it. And again, interestingly, let's go back. Whew. We don't see Taiwan here, which is, I think, a super interesting kind of, Taiwan started as an industrial policy. Taiwan Semiconductor did. If I think about dollars, got a lot of numbers here. China's pretty big. This is actually investment in a venture capital fund called the Big Fund. They need like a focus group to work on their naming. And then this is all kind of provincial policies, which dwarfs it. The interesting thing here is everyone's doing it, and everyone's doing it in different ways. Why are they doing that? That's like its own kind of interesting kind of question. Like why? But like the neat thing is, I know I'm like, as an economist, I get very excited when government or any individuals kind of look at something and say, I'm going to go kind of respond to my environment and do things a different way. So presumably they're doing it to match their settings, or perhaps maybe to skirt rules. Okay, so what else are we going to find? We're going to see a lot of policy activism. We're going to see that subsidies are the dominant form of support, but there are a lot of different ways of offering support. So last thing. So we've got industry growing, interesting constant industries consolidating. We've got decreasing in prices, price convergence, leader-follower game. Governments are actively involved in this. We want to be able to untangle all of these things and say, so what? So what should the WTO do? What are actionable recommendations we can do about the world? So in my one slide, I'm going to say, so what we do is we write down a model of fab competition. Fabs are going to make take it or leave it offers to buyers. So buyers, NVIDIA, fabrication facility, TSMC. They're going to go and say, we're going to go buy 90 nanometer chips or 5 nanometer chips at a particular wafer size, and there's a price, and that's going to be conditional on all sorts of characteristics. We're going to discipline, so this is just the kind of the theory. We're going to discipline the model with the wafer pricing data. We're going to allow for all sorts of things you probably were thinking in your head, what about quality differences? You just put up China. Well, maybe China chips just aren't very good. Turns out they're better. Like in terms, we have yield information, you can show like, well, actually the yields on Chinese chips coming from Chinese factories are above other factories. So what are we going to find? We're going to write down a model and estimate it, using data. So of course the model is going to match the data in characteristics we care about. It's going to generate those price curves. We're then going to do some external validation, say like, look at TSMC, do the margins match up? And here the analog to our model is the gross margin. Yeah, it's actually really good. Like kind of shockingly, like if I put it up there, you'd be like, I think you rigged that. I didn't. Interestingly, the model is going to say that they're giving up a lot of money to price low. Why do we price low? If learning by doing, I price low, move down the demand curve, drives up demand, I do a lot of stuff, I learn from that, so the next time my costs go down, that provides me a comparative advantage. Or if I think that there's future demand that's kind of popping, gives me a margin advantage. So we're going to see that these forces are really big. Why? Because in the data, all of the price sequences are doing what I showed you. They're all starting high, driving down low, regardless of if there's competition or not. And then lastly, because we have the data so rich, we're going to look at learning by doing inside the firm, TSMC, across locations. We're going to see it's pretty small, 4.7%. Like learning by doing this kind of story all came from semiconductors, and there it was in the 60s through BSG. Well, at Fairchild, yeah. And so and there the number was 20%. Now there was no econometrics. There was like, it seems like we're saving about this. So this is quite a bit lower, and this is lower than Irwin and Klenow. Interestingly, so then we're going to look at technology pair, still pretty small. Interestingly, we're going to see a lot of cross-country impacts. And we're going to spend a lot of time in the paper thinking about like, why is that? And we think that's because of like the fact that this whole network is integrated together. And that places like this company we bought the data from are playing the role of helping each other learn how to harmonize their systems together. Now, why do we care about that? Well, one, it's kind of interesting to know how the world works. But also, if the industry is all interacting, and different countries are all subsidizing, and there's learning by doing, that means when the US CHIPS Act gets introduced and says, like, we're gonna go give a bunch of money, they're actually benefiting from policy in China or in Europe that's also providing incentive to build plants to grow faster. They're getting this kind of free lunch learning. And so then there's this sense of, well, if you're the WTO, maybe you kind of think about these complementarities and how like these are actually playing off each other. So that's the kind of the whirlwind tour of the paper. Happy to talk much more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Everybody's staying pretty much on time. So what we're going to do is take 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll go back to the panel. We'll cannibalize a little bit of the next break. So I've got Eric, Sue, and then the next hand I saw was, I don't know your name, but striped shirt. Yes, Jeff. Okay, that's the first 3. We'll start to Eric, please. Here, you have mine. I'll get another one.
Thanks so much. These are great. I was thinking a lot about the expertise versus bias trade-off, both when Hassan was talking, when Gale was talking, and also in the context of embedded autonomy. Basically, when I mean expertise by bias, like who are the people in the government agency who are making these decisions? And on the one hand, and how close are they to the industry? It's very important that they have knowledge of the industry. Typically, that's people who've been insiders, on the private side at some point, and then, but you worry that maybe they're a little too cozy with and so how do you combine both, people who are knowledgeable and people who are independent?
Actually, it was one of the people in a tiny way was me. I actually reviewed. I was a reviewer for that strategy department, that strategy document you mentioned when I was at the White House. But I had a question actually for both Hassan and Gale. Just sort of digging in. Maybe this is too deep, but thinking about the theory of friendshoring and the packaging. Is there a way of sort of positive sum where we're like both promoting innovation in packaging in the U.S., we're continuing employment in Malaysia, not dooming them to labor-intensive production forever? Anyway, how does the positive sum theory play out, or can it?
My question concerns manpower, and it's, I guess, primarily for Hassan, but I'd be interested in everybody's answer. I'll just say quickly that I was at a company called Infinera. We built the only greenfield fab built in Silicon Valley in the 21st century. And I know the core engineering team very well. By the way, we did an IPO. We all made a lot of money, which is nice. Of the core engineering team, I would say 20% were American, and the rest were from places like Singapore, India, China, Morocco, Turkey. And so the question is, the point Professor Stiglitz raised, the most important thing in semiconductors is not the silicon, it's the people. And is the US government doing enough, or what is it doing, to encourage young people to study those dry STEM subjects like chemistry, material sciences, and so on, that make up the fundamental bedrock of an industry?
Okay, let's give some quick answers, and then we'll, or actually, should we maybe I'll get all the questions and give you guys a chance to say what you want at the end, because that way we get more questions. I have Joe and one in the back there. Okay, Joe. That's right behind you.
So I had two questions. One on the issue of expertise, which I think is a really difficult one. But the Malaysian government has many sources of expertise. One of them is they have Khazanah, which is a big investment fund. And that investment fund invests in a whole variety of things. And one of their functions as basically a sovereign wealth fund is to absorb information which they use for public purpose and translate. So one of the broad questions is, I think we ought to be thinking in industrial policy about the whole framework by which information gets absorbed. And among the tools is government co-investment in projects, sometimes abroad, for absorbing information. And obviously China has done that. The second question relates to the discussion of, that you pointed out, massive subsidies for this sector. And this is maybe too hypothetical and theoretical, but if you had perfect capital markets with learning by doing and no cross-sector spillovers, there'd really be no justification. The industry would understand that it pays to produce more. The marginal cost, the marginal value of production is not just the sales you get today, but the reduction in your future costs. So the question is this an industry ripoff of the rest of us, or is there a real market failure that you're addressing?
Okay, no, there's one more microphone got passed to the back, and then we'll give it back to you guys, because that's the way the time's going to go. Please.
Hi, my name is Gustavo. I have a question for Hassan. So I have been studying R&D subsidy programs in different countries. This is the first time that I have a policymaker on the room that I can ask some questions to. So I will ask to you some questions that I received multiple times during my talks. It's the following. The success of an R&D subsidy program really depends on to whom you are allocating those subsidies to. And one of the main goals, I think, in designing this program is you want to subsidize firms that otherwise, without the subsidy, wouldn't implement that program, that project. Otherwise, if the firm would implement regardless of the subsidy, you are just giving money to the private sector. And I guess you don't want to do that. So my question is, how do you design the program such that you target these marginal firms that would only implement the project because of the subsidy, and how do you select them when you see a ton of applications, 600 different applications? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're officially at time, but we started a little bit late, so I'm going to go. We'll go in the same order, and you can take the questions as you. I'll give you both, each of you, a few minutes to speak. Take whichever questions you want, because I can't control that. That clock is fast.
We got
okay.
4 minutes by my watch. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, so
let's do a round, and then if we have more time, we'll go.
Okay, I'm not going to promise I remember every question because I forgot to bring up a notepad, but you guys both talked about expertise. So first of all, I'm going to say this. That's technically my job, okay? And I don't think anyone in the industry thinks I'm their pal. I'm pretty mean to them, okay? That's what I try to be, is I don't want them to come in here and feel cozy with me. But there is a real problem. No, it's a genuine problem with, like, the folks who know the industry well are the folks who've been working in the industry. And so we actually have a lot of folks who've come from the industry that, you know, for example, were at Intel or Global Foundries for a long time, and we have ethics rules that recuse them from being able to do that type of work. But I would say broadly, if you looked within the Department of Commerce prior to the passage of the Chips and Science Act, how many people had come from the semiconductor industry and worked there? It was a rounding error, right? So there's two. One, when you start up a program like this, you have to bring in people. They're going to come from industry because that's where the knowledge exists. The question that I think is a tougher one is, how do you maintain that capability? Because I think we all expect that there's going to be cycles, right? We're going to do a CHIPS Act. We're probably not going to do one every single 3 years. We may, but that creates a different problem. So that's one thing to consider. I'm gonna jump around for a moment. But there were a couple questions on what does it take for success, right? With regards to, I think both Sue, you kind of asked about this with regards to friendshoring, and then you also asked about this with regards to success. So when we look at, like, would that project have happened without our funding? Well, you can look empirically. Even US headquartered firms, you might say, oh, you're giving a ton of money to Intel or Micron. Go look at where the fabs they've built in the last decade are. They were not in the United States, even if they were US headquartered firms. Certainly TSMC was not building facilities in the United States. It was building them in Taiwan, as Jeff sort of showed us with great detail. But the majority of Micron's manufacturing capacity is in Japan and Taiwan. The newest fab that Intel has brought on to manufacturing is in Ireland, right? So you can see that, ex ante, we can see that they were making decisions that they were not going to build these facilities in the United States until the cost structure was improved. And then we do a lot of work, you know, evaluating, as I sort of walk through the specific criteria, and I'm happy to talk about more on, like, will this project be successful? Lastly, I'm going to touch on friendshoring so I don't take too much of the mic. I'd go look at, the secretary has made comments about this, right? Where we are trying to understand, in an industry like packaging that's undergoing a technological shift from conventional to advanced that changes the capital versus labor share, trying to understand where can the United States play in a sustainable manner, right? It does not make sense to invest in heavily labor intensive industries in the United States because we'll never compete on price with China. Jeff showed that, right? They will outcompete us on price. But where there is friendshoring capability is that we are learning there are locales where they have a willingness to do a lot of the work that Malaysia did, for example, right? Being able to get a project up and running has a lot of economic value to a firm. If I want to go to a new location and I've never built something there, do the roads work? Do the airplanes work? Do the utilities work? Will I be able to find people? Reducing that uncertainty changes a lot of their economic calculus. Because right now, when they go look at it, you might on a dollar per dollar basis have lower wages, but if it's going to take me 4 extra years to build all the utilities and infrastructure, then my return profile doesn't look as good because I started to sink money into it. So I do think there are elements where we can play that and help countries understand what it takes to get projects moving faster. And you saw examples from Gale's work where Malaysia implemented that stuff.
Okay, I think maybe I will talk about the expertise a little bit. I mean, at least in the case of Malaysia, I don't think I've ever met a policy person who would say the industry hates us. It's a very friendly, cozy relationship.
I'll be very clear.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a personal thing.
Okay. I think this was the point that I was trying to make in terms of how the industry has started in Malaysia, which was about appeasement. It was about attracting them and to give them a lot, and that legacy continues to exist. And there isn't really that much expertise in ministries or in like government agencies, and there's a lot of advisory groups, board members, et cetera, that come directly from companies. Of course, as you said, that's where the knowledge is. But I guess the question I have in mind is, what are the long-term objectives for the Malaysian government, for its people, for its environment, for its economy? And do these companies know that? And are they giving advice from that perspective? I think this, to me, is the final question of, is it good to always rely on foreign firms? And then the next difficult question is, well, how do you build this expertise within the Malaysian government, for example, when you don't have, the types of research institutes or the universities like you have in Europe or here that is, having PhDs like Hassan, for example. And I just wanted to point to one thing about Khazanah. I mean, the two companies that they helped, I think it was Silterra and Inari as well, Tobias? I don't know. Those are wafer fabrication companies which are failing, bought over. I mean, there just hasn't been this ability for local companies to compete with foreign firms. This is just a lifelong problem when you have foreign firms that are so big, so good, doing everything really well, and you hope that suppliers can come in, but they will never compete with them. This is a problem. This is a difficulty of moving up in the value chain. And so thinking about regional markets, et cetera, could be helpful. I don't really know how to answer the friendshoring question, but I thought it was interesting to see that Intel has opened a very big advanced packaging plant in Penang, and it's now becoming a policy priority for the government because advanced packaging is back end, but it's like front end because it requires very expensive equipment, and then there's a little more skills development, et cetera. And maybe then I'll just move to the skills question, which is a big one in Malaysia. I think it's a big one everywhere. We heard it this morning. How do you have more STEM graduates? I mean, when I was little, they also said that. How do you have more STEM graduates? I guess it's a lifelong problem for eternity. In the case of Malaysia, at least, there is an influx of low-skilled foreign workers, but not high-skilled. They're trying to build this up through the local universities, and it's clearly not working. I mean, there's no universities that are like in Singapore, for example, that have very good departments, et cetera. We have companies like Intel going into departments and trying to train students, run courses. But you can't compete with neighboring countries, like even with China, in terms of their graduates. So there is this problem of trying to get skills, and I don't know if I can say very much more about it, but it is a problem. Yeah.
Minutes, 2 minutes ago, so we got 8 minutes. So we can answer, and then we can maybe take a couple more questions. Yeah, go.
Professor Stiglitz's question is the one I think about constantly. So I don't know, maybe drank the Kool-Aid and really believe that markets tend to work unless proven otherwise. And so this is something I think a lot about is like, what's the market failure? Absent the learning by doing stuff. One thing that we're like kind of my dream, kind of where I want to take this project is to start. The measurement exercise is too strong, but to some sense to say like how important are these subsidies? So if like in a world without subsidies as a counterfactual, what does the network look like? And to try to back out, well, if they're spending this much to get this, like kind of what are the implications of that? How does that vary across countries? There's a lot of kind of heroic leaps of faith that you have to take in terms of like information that people have and whatnot. But I think that's like understanding these things to me seems like a fundamental question. I do worry that like in some sense you can back out the residual, but it's a residual and it's like, okay, what does that explain? If I can't say it's a market failure, then it's national security. And there's like some sense of like, I don't know what is national security. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not. It is when I tend to not like residuals as kind of I tried everything else and this is what I got. So that's like the first thing. The thing that actually so that's the first thing that keeps me up at night, but in kind of an excited way. Like, like, oh, what can we do? The one that keeps me up at night is like, maybe this is a colossal mistake, is what if this isn't, so we as part of this project, we talked to Chiang Tai-Sheh, who's he's a professor at Booth, but he also an economic advisor to Taiwan. And so one of the comments he said with TSMC locating in Arizona that they're experiencing is that American workers just don't have it's not just being skilled in STEM disciplines, it's having the willingness to work methodically, repeatedly. So just you're doing the same thing at a high degree of precision. So the thing that keeps me up at night is what if that is not something that can be taught, but if that is something that's cultural? And there's some sense that like, maybe Americans just aren't good at this. And like, that's the part that like, you can't teach that. And so like, that's the part that like, so if someone wants to tell me I'm wrong on that, that would make me very happy. So, yeah, that'd be great.
No, so I'd love to respond to this one. So, I want a couple thoughts to think about, right? With Professor Stiglitz. Before I worked in this, I worked in the solar industry, right? And China today, everyone says, has, correct me, like somewhere between 3x global demand in their capacity, right? So I think we have to ask this question, like, what is the world getting for this? What does the world get if we create a bunch of new semiconductor fabs that end up being underutilized? But probably in the long term, we find a utilization for them because we will digitize more and more things. That's one question I think about is one answer. The second one I really want to answer is, we heard a lot about this, that American workers can't make chips and we don't work hard. I think most folks here probably work in America and they work very, very long hours doing very tedious things like checking the citations on their research papers, right? Almost as tedious as working in a fab. And we've had news in the last 2 weeks that Arizona's TSMC facility has higher yields than they did in Taiwan. Right? So I fully expect that firms, like the CHIPS Act is also a massive FDI program. We don't talk about it that way. No one talks about it that way. I haven't heard the word FDI talked about the CHIPS Act once in this room today, but it is an FDI program because two of the largest investments are by Samsung and TSMC. So there obviously, when German firms go to Malaysia, there are cultural differences in how they work. When US firms went to China, there were cultural differences in how they work. We are now seeing FDI work in an opposite direction. Some people say globalization is dying. I think it's just changing. And so when that happens, there are naturally frictions in accommodation. I don't think it's like, as humans, we will learn to do the work. But there will be frictions as we learn to do the work from a different culture. Right? So that one I think is important to touch on. Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to give the mic back to the audience for a couple last words, because why not? Because we have 2 minutes left. So I have a hand right here. Here, take my mic, and then I'll just give you a.
So I'm Chinese Malaysian, growing up next to semiconductor plants. So my questions become more personal. So I want to understand, you guys talk about industrial policy as if it is standalone to explain the success of semiconductor industry in Malaysia. How about trade policy? How about FDI policy? For the longest time, what we are emphasizing in Malaysia is actually the FDI policy and the role of attracting semiconductor plants, FDI firms. The role is to increase employment and to access the US and EU market. Certainly not to serve the local market, because there's no capacity to absorb all these things. So the know-how comes from FDI firm, using the local labor to absorb the unemployment in order to access the US market or the EU market, mainly the US market. So there's a big role of FDI in playing here. So we don't talk about industrial policy standalone, but if you talk about industrial policy in Malaysia, you have to talk about the failure of auto industry in Malaysia, which is a big industrial policy that also national car policy that do not rely on FDI and leads to failure. So there is a distinction there that perhaps one of you can touch on. Finally, when you talk about success of Taiwan and China in semiconductor industries, how much of the increase in Chinese export or the production of chips is actually driven by FDI firms from Taiwan? Perhaps when the technology in Taiwan is mature, they move to China to use the labor. So can you actually tease out the differences between the rise in China? Part of it is actually driven by Taiwanese firm investing in China.